You've probably heard of people speaking German in Texas or Namibia or even Kazakhstan, but how many countries can you go to and find people speaking German? As someone who is actually crazy enough, German to learn, this is something I've always sort of wondered. So outside the usual Central European countries, where can you find people speaking German? How did they get to these far-flung places? And how have their dialects and customs changed or stayed the same over the decades and centuries? So how many countries speak German? Well, including all of those with communities of German speakers, the number can be as high as 24. When you think of places that speak German, you probably think of Germany, Austria, most of Switzerland, oh yeah, and also Liechtenstein, and maybe also parts of Belgium and sort of Luxembourg. And you'd be right, but those countries are far from the only places you can find people sprechen die Deutsch. Otherwise, why would I even be making this video? Probably the most notable place outside those countries is Alsace-Lorraine, the place most likely to start a war. No, I mean in the comment section of this video. While the predominant language of daily life these days is French,
quelle surprise la seconde boulangerie du jour réserve-t-elle à notre jury?
The region is home to its own Upper German dialect known as Alsatian, closely related to Swiss German, or Schweizerdeutsch.
Ich wohne in Volga, es ist eine kleine Stadt, so ungefähr 25 Kilometer von Straßburg.
But after being passed between France and Germany several times over the course of 100 years, the teaching of German was banned in the region after World War I, and even after that, throughout much of the latter half of the 20th century, newspapers were not allowed to publish more than 25% of their content in German. In recent decades, however, Alsatian has made somewhat of a comeback as public schools have begun Alsatian immersion programs, although more or less banning the language for several decades has made it kinda hard for these schools to find enough teachers. While smaller, closer-to-home communities exist across South Denmark, Slovakia, Poland's historic Upper Silesia region, and Hungarian towns like Sopron, one of the most notable German diasporas in Europe can be found in Romania. Many of these groups date all the way back to waves of immigrants invited to Transylvania by King Geza II of Hungary. German Romanians, however, are not one group, but several different communities from Saxons to Swabians living everywhere from Transylvania to Dobruja to the Banatul Mountains. While these communities have certainly had a huge cultural influence over the centuries, in the past 80 or so years, many have begun to move back to Germany, with their numbers today now barely a rounding error compared to their former 800,000 strong population. While the numbers are still declining to this day, this also relates to what happened in the years after World War II, when many countries across Central and Eastern Europe deported hundreds of thousands of ethnic Germans from their territories. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, many Germans were similarly encouraged to resettle in Russia and become Russian subjects with certain freedoms. And many took the invitation, establishing towns and communities along the Volga River, which explains why they're called Volga Germans. Initially, these communities received certain rights and freedoms, such as freedom from serving in the army, that attracted groups such as the Mennonites. However, that only lasted for around 100 years, when later czars abolished these privileges, motivating many to leave for countries like the United States, Brazil, and Argentina, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here. In the early years of the Soviet Union, they even had their own republic within the Russian SFSR, the Volga German ASSR. However, this only lasted until 1941 for understandable reasons. After this, the Volga German ASSR was dissolved and much of its populace deported further east, now primarily residing in the Kherson Oblast of southwestern Siberia. Of the 600,000 Volga Germans out there, around 200,000 live throughout northern Kazakhstan, particularly along the Russian border. Outside of Europe, well, Europe plus DLC I guess, Namibia is a notable example of a place where one might find German spoken. This is of course because Namibia was once a colony of the German Empire, at the time known as Deutsch Südwestafrika. However, these days, English is the official language of the country, and not all that many people there actually speak German, which actually makes sense considering the colony was only in German hands for 31 years. The influence is still there though, from architecture to cuisine to street names. Germany was a bit too late to the colonization game to make any sort of meaningful influence, which is actually probably for the best. However, probably the biggest mark Germans would make outside of Europe came through immigration, what with all the wars and revolutions going on across the German states back in the 19th century, possibly most notably to the United States and Canada, with German speakers today most prominently residing in North and South Dakota. I mean, North Dakota's capital isn't named Bismarck for nothing. Also worth mentioning is Texas German, a High German dialect still found in and around the appropriately named Fredericksburg. Another famous storied group are the Pennsylvania Dutch, who are actually German, and are called such not because ignorant English speakers confused Dutch with Deutsch, but because they confused it with Deutsch. There's even a Bavarian-themed town in central Washington called Leavenworth, although the whole German theme is really more of a thing that two guys in the 60s thought of to promote tourism in the town. Sort of like Solvang, California. Although, to be fair, given the overtourism we're seeing in cities like Venice, I'm fully on board with more American towns doing stuff like this. Just don't skimp out on the walkability part, no one wants a car-centric Florence. You might have also heard the story about the referendum on whether the US's official language should be English or German, and how German only lost by one vote. Except it's not exactly true, in that it's literally not true at all. Ignoring the obvious historical context of us having been colonized by an English-speaking country, or even the fact that the US doesn't actually assign any language as official, the actual vote in question was just a debate in Congress on whether or not to print federal laws in German as well as English. Okay, that felt like a lot of look at this, but no, look at this, but actually no. So let's look at one more region of the world with strong German-speaking communities, Latin America. While the US was the most popular destination for German immigrants in the 19th and 20th centuries, more than 1 million German speakers lived throughout Latin America, and in one country in particular, Brazil. Several groups fled the various wars and revolutions of their homeland throughout the mid-19th century, resettling in states like Santa Catarina and Rio Grande do Sul, making up not one of the biggest immigrant communities in Brazil, but certainly one of the oldest. One of you, whose name I presume is pronounced Lagardos, told me in a recent community post, "I'm from southernmost Brazil and part of the German community. Although I don't happen to speak it myself, still learning, my mother and her family all still do. And the language can be heard quite frequently once you go to more rural areas of the region." And this hints at the broader trend across the Americas, as many German immigrants to the New World have often tended to blend in, especially in the big cities. In the southernmost states of Paraná, Santa Catarina, and Rio Grande do Sul, the dialect has even diverged into the Hunsrück language, named after the Hunsrück region of Saarland and Rhineland-Palatinate. Lagardos 907 also clarified that language would be a more correct term for it, and it has influenced the local Portuguese dialect quite a bit, with words and phrases such as alles gut and Menschenkinder being commonly heard in conversations. Many towns across these states, like Blumenau, are often likened to Little Germanys, with their fair share of linguistic, cultural, and architectural influences, and Oktoberfest celebrations to boot. Although, of course, when talking about German speakers in South America, there's quite the elephant in the room. There were already many well-entrenched German communities across Argentina well before World War II, and many German Jews were allowed to resettle the country. Many Volga Germans also resettled in Argentina throughout the late 19th century, and around 10% of the country's population today can claim some form of German ancestry. However, the joke conspiracy of Nazis fleeing to Argentina isn't entirely untrue, as several former high-ranking officers were also allowed to resettle there. Okay, let's finish this up with one more country, mostly as a palate cleanser. In Mexico, the story, quite unsurprisingly, mirrors that of its American neighbors, with somewhere around several tens of thousands of Mexicans of German ancestry, particularly in two groups, Mennonites from Russia and cousins of the Texas Germans we looked at earlier. See, I told you German is not such a useless language after all. However, it is important to note that, particularly in the Americas, these are mostly just ancestral languages, not the language of daily life. Someone from Blumenau is just as likely to be a native Portuguese speaker as someone from Fredericksburg is to be a native English speaker, particularly in the younger generation, i.e. very, but the influence still remains all the same. And last on our list, the German state of Majorca.